All right. Jayse, thank you very much for joining me here for an awful reason, but still, I think, a very important reason. We recently found out that Mark Coleran had passed away. Mark Coleran is an unbelievable creative legend. Mark is probably best known for pioneering the creative concept of FUI, or the fantasy user interface, or fictional user interface, or futuristic user interface. But Mark also did many other things. And don't get it twisted. Mark is an amazing person, and he's much more than just his work, but his work is an unbelievable legacy in and of itself. And so I thought it would be really nice for us just to reflect on his work. I know both of us are enormous fans. If I can introduce you, Jayse, if anybody's not familiar, Jayse is a legendary creative himself, also creating all sorts of amazing fictional and real world forward thinking technologies for gigantic films, Iron Man heads up displays, and many, many other things that have made an indelible mark on science fiction, and something that I think is, very much in the mold of Mark's work and his specialty, as well as all sorts of other exciting stuff. And so to me, it's awesome to have an opportunity just to kind of pick your brain a little bit, Jayse, about Mark and his work, and the sort of like overlap and experiences that you guys had.
Yeah, he really started me along that path. So before I met Mark, I didn't know that screen UI design was even a thing. I just thought it just kind of appeared in films, and I always thought it was the coolest stuff. And but I never had thoughts like, oh, I want to do that someday. I just thought, man, that's really cool. It was like my favorite parts of the film. And when I saw Mark's work and his reel, and I saw that he had done many, if not most, of the things that I loved, that was a great realization of
So I feel like almost anyone who's familiar with Mark had a similar sort of moment. This is the second of the legendary Mark Coleran reels, and I'm just gonna let this one play. And I'm playing the second one because it has a lot of the content that is in the previous one. The previous one, or is this, maybe this is the first one? No. This is the second one, right? Yeah. So this is 2008, I believe. The first reel was 2006.
Yeah,
I saw that reel. I had the same exact reaction. Like, first off, it was just like, holy crap. Of course, there's somebody who makes all of these fictional technologies that you see in these movies. And then the immediate following thought is like, that must be the coolest job ever. Yeah. I would love to do that. Yep. That kind of work.
Yeah.
And,
I had the same feeling. I was like, after a while, it took me about maybe 6 months until I was like, maybe I could do that. After seeing Mark's work, I had met Mark before I knew what he did through Angie Taylor.
Really?
Yeah. And so we were teaching at NAB. I would teach After Effects here in Vegas. And so she brought her friend one time. And so, because I had taught with Angie a few times, I think, every year. And she brought Mark, just kind of like, hey, this is my friend Mark. And she had him guest speak. And he played his reel and, for the crowd. And I was just like, what is this? This is insane. And and then I think a few months went by, and I had to reach out, and I asked him, like, how did you get started, and how did you do all this? And he said he started in VFX, so he was like painting out wires from stunts, and doing tracking and stuff like that. And they at the time, a lot of this work was all done by VFX artists, so it wasn't handed off to designers, and that's why. And it's still the same kind of today. Sometimes they'll just give it to a VFX artist who's like, well, I don't know what to do. I'll just try to make something cool, and that's why a lot of it doesn't have like a design sense to it. A lot of it doesn't look necessarily real sometimes. And so when Mark started, he was looking at that stuff, and he's like, I could do better than that, because he had a background in print design. He had, since high school, he had taken classes on technical drawing. His first job was going, basically scanning in paper technical drawings and recreating them in CAD. I was like in the 90s, early 90s. So he had this precision already, and he had this design sense. And so when he saw kind of what was happening with, these screens, he's like, let me try. I think I could do something really cool. And so he started. I think his first film was this is a James Bond film, The World Is Not Enough.
Yep.
Which came out in '98, I think. So I think he started working on that in '97. And once you're, it's kind of what he taught me. It was like, once you're in, you're kind of in. So make sure that you want to be in, make sure you want to do this kind of work. So I thought about it. I couldn't find anybody who was teaching it. I couldn't find anything.
Yeah.
I didn't want to bother Mark. I just figured everybody was bothering him. So I'm like, how am I even going to learn, how to do this stuff? So I started learning infographics. There was a little bit more stuff on how to create infographics. And
data visualization was like just becoming kind of a hot thing in design and whatnot. Yeah.
So I went that route, and I just mastered kind of Illustrator and Photoshop, and started roughing out kind of how to try to do this stuff. And I made I was working on Intel corporate video, and I convinced them, like, what if we did this thing where you could have futuristic computer screens, and we could fly through them, and we could show this process of a virus taking over and all this stuff. And they went for it. They said, yeah, that sounds great. So I was like, awesome. I've got my first FUI gig, and I did it. I sent it to Mark, and I said, hey, I know this is terrible, but I really had fun doing it. And if you ever need anybody to work for you for free, like a ghost designer, or do little widgets or anything, let me know, because I would love to be a part of that. And the next day he sent me an email and said, well, it's not terrible. That's all he wrote. And then the next email was a forward to some of his film guys saying, hey, check out this guy. He's got the right mix of skills. It was very low key, right? And I was just like, holy shit, this is it. The introduction. I've got the introduction. Mm-hmm. So that's where I started with Mark, and he ended up being a real mentor throughout my whole career. So
that's amazing to hear, because so much of what you're describing, I've also witnessed happening through you. And I know there's many people that have reached out to you and been like, hey, I'll do anything to work for free for the Jayse Hansen. and I know there's been, a number of people who have, you've helped out and provided that guidance to. And I'm sure, a lot of that was inspired by your experience directly with Mark.
Yeah. That's how Mark on to me is how helpful he was. Yeah.
So I was deeply intimidated by Mark. I didn't meet him for maybe like a year or two after seeing his first reel. And I was really stoked because probably about 6 months after I saw his first reel, we had a client bring his reel to us.
You were at Perception at that time?
I was at Perception, and we were pitching the broadcast package for the 2008 election on ABC News. We were doing this in like late 2006 or early 2007 with the intent that, like, you know, it goes through the primaries and everything. And one of the producers at ABC News was just like, hey, do you think we could make a broadcast package that like kind of felt like this sort of stuff? And we were like, I was stoked, but also at the same time, I was like, well, hold on, this is like the presidential election. Like, you can't make it look like a video game. Like, that would be, we'll need to save that for 2024's election year. That's when it should look like a video game, not back in pleasant old 2008. But it was still an opportunity for me to like start with trying to capture some of that essence and then trying to like neutralize it a little bit or make it maybe a little more consumable, or just not as, you know, didn't want it to necessarily come off like fiction or something playful. Not long after getting into that process, Mark was invited to speak at the New York City After Effects users group meetups, which were held in like a public school auditorium. It was put together by Aaron Rabinowitz and Jim Gettledyk, who put these sessions together. It was like, you know, a random Wednesday night with a whole bunch of sweaty nerds in an auditorium, just geeking out.
Good times.
And Mark was there and gave a presentation and went through his stuff. And like, I was just hanging on every single syllable. Like, I was just like, this is it. I can't believe, like, I'm hearing directly from the guy that did this stuff. And afterwards, I very sort of meekly approached him, and I was just like, you know, fanboying out and just being like, oh, you know, your stuff's really impressive. And, you know, if you see the election coverage this year, you might feel that you had an influence there. And I was so intimidated by him that I couldn't even bear to like wait for a response from him or anything. And I was just like, okay, goodbye. And I like just took off and ran to the other side of the room and was still just like super, super, super stoked. And I crossed paths with him many years later. And in that time that had passed, because, you know, he had made that mark on me, I had the wonderful fortune of having some opportunities come up to do things like work on Iron Man 2 and several other films, doing the Mark Coleran thing, creating fictional gadgets and technologies and computer interfaces that appear in these stories and move the narrative forward and whatnot. And so at one point, and I had been, you know, keeping track of his career and his trajectory, and he sort of went off the radar a little bit. And like, we weren't seeing new work from Coleran. And then murmurs came out, well, it's because he's working on real tech.
Yeah.
He's not making pretend stuff for the movies. He's making real tech. And like, in that moment, I was just like, well, of course, like, oh my God, it makes perfect sense. And it got me excited about the notion and the challenge of taking these skills and carrying them over to real tech. And so years after meeting him at the After Effects users group, I was doing a mixture of work in film and work on real world tech. And was giving a presentation at Samsung HQ in San Francisco, or sorry, their design offices. I think it was like SDA, Samsung Design America, or something like that in downtown San Francisco. And I was giving a presentation and kind of like a capabilities thing about what, we were doing at Perception and whatnot at the time. And in the room full of, 15 people at Samsung, Mark Coleran was one of them.
Was he working?
And I used to love going in and giving these presentations to a room full of people. And I was just immediately like, shit, what am I going to do? Like, Mark's, how do I give a presentation on this stuff when this guy is here?
Yep.
And cheeky guy that he is, he just kind of sat back and he was enjoying the presentation. And, once I got maybe like 2/3 of the way through it, he started just sort of like getting like a step ahead of me, or just like he could tell like where everything was going and would be like, I bet your next slide has this on it, or something like that. And I'd be like, yes, exactly. That's correct. And whatnot. And so, I talked to him afterwards and, told him, he kept fanboying out on him. And then it was years and years later, probably at one of the motion conferences in Santa Fe. And at that point, I think I had even probably worked with him briefly a little bit on something here or there. And we were talking at Motion, and I was relaying this story of running into him at Samsung and him kind of like, basically fucking with me while I was doing this thing, and how I thought it was hilarious. And like, I was just like, and that was it, man. You had me like in the palm of your hands. Like, I'm a sweaty mess, and you could have, you could have flipped me over the table and, kicked my ass, and everyone probably would have applauded it. Just like it was, you could just read that dynamic in the room. And to me, it was just hilarious. And Mark was like, he was like taken aback. Like, I think even like and we're hanging out the whole conference, and you're there as well. And Robin's there and Navarro's there and whatnot. We're all hanging out and having a great time. And it was like a full day later that like there was a quiet moment, and it was just the two of us. And he was like, hey man, like, I'm really sorry about that back in San Francisco. Like, that was so like not cool for me. I was like, no, it was all good. It was fine, And I was genuinely touched that he was like, he was concerned that he had ruffled some pathetic young fanboys' feathers back in the day. But that was it. And so like, to me, to have that opportunity to kind of transition from just being a huge fan to, being a friend of his, like that was to me, a really, really big deal. And I still, looked up to him and would get really excited anytime he would fire me over a DM or a comment about, anything that I was doing, or when he was keeping me updated on the things that he was getting into and whatnot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have any projects of his that particularly stood out to you, or that were like iconic to you in your mind?
Yeah, The Island is definitely one of my favorite all-time UIs that he has done. This is just beyond gorgeous. From the fact that the UI is like mimicking these vials and these lines that are, it's a big part of the film too. If you watch the film, Chelsea and I were actually watching this film last night. We were like, because Chelsea, my wife, is, really good friends with him as well. And so she said, let's watch The Island, and I had forgotten how much of that film is told through screens. Through these designs, and you see them just everywhere. They're just everywhere. And I just thought, man, this is beautiful, beautiful work. It looks three-dimensional. It all has a a consistency through it. It's really gone beyond just making a fancy UI. It all has a pattern to it. It all has a flow.
It looks so practical. Uh-huh. It looks so real. It does not, and it's beautiful and it's gorgeously composed, but there is no aspect of it that feels like it's just a smattering of elements or cool layers, just sort of arranged together to convey a thought. Like, it really, at immediate glance, it feels like an exceptionally practical, tangible piece of real software. And you can tell that, even though I may not know what every single control or function or window or button is going to do, and I mean, even I can make very, I think, relatively accurate assumptions on many of these things, but I can tell by looking at it that Mark knew every single interaction that would happen. The things that the actors would never interact with, he still knew what they would trigger, what they would do, what they would activate.
Go back a second. You can see even on the left of that anesthesia incision, it's steps that they're taking.
Yeah.
Look at the last one though.
Yep.
Euthanize. I mean, this is directly to the story. And then I remember him telling me that these those little 3D kind of widgets, I think he made those in Lightwave, or he made it in one of the newer little 3D packages. But he just rendered out a rotation of it, and then in After Effects he was able to use that same rotation for all of them and just offset the pattern. And I thought that was so smart. And then for the center part, this was actually animated because it was like it was supposed to be a live display. Mm-hmm. And I was like, how did you get that asset? And he said, it's just a collection of different stills that I had, and I just warped them and animated them. And he said he learned that, like, the heart doesn't just kind of pump. He said it's a very complex kind of thing that he had to animate. And it looks amazing in the film. It's great. He also did this one in like a dark mode, and that's the first time I ever saw, like, I said, is this a dark mode? There's a light mode and a dark mode. And he said the darker version of this, I'm not sure if it's in your in this collection, but the darker version was they projected on glass. And but this is way before anybody had dark modes for anything. And I just thought, that's amazing. I mean, it doesn't have the dark mode in here, but
really, really spectacular stuff. I love how I'm always obsessed with the diagonal caution lines. That's one of my favorite motifs in all of this stuff, because it is such a like familiar real world symbol or signifier. And those sort of things, Mark was just so good at deploying and implementing into any of these layouts, any of these screens. This one always stuck with me for some reason. Just the amount of detail that's in here, the clarity of this, the notion of like there's the right amount of high frequency detail in certain areas, but then there's like much broader, stronger gestures that are creating these like really pleasing silhouettes. And in the film, the fact that like the center part of this scope, like there's like a spherized kind of, like lens effect that gives just this slight distortion when things move in and out of that space. So wild to me.
And you can piece out each piece of this, like you've got the brightness at the top, and the bottom is that zoom, and like it's just such a great design. I remember him actually talking to we call them subject matter experts, and he just asked, what would be in your ultimate HUD if you had this task. And so that's where he got all the info for this shot. Yeah.
So I remember Mark very, very proudly relaying the story, and I think I've heard him say it more than once in person. So if you know Mark, I'm going to say a 50% chance that he has shared this story. And he basically described it as like his proudest moment of his career was being on the set of The Island and finessing and nitpicking the graphics and just continually fine tuning them. And it was driving Michael Bay insane and like really pissing off Michael Bay. And Mark was still like, saying like, no, it has to, like, we're not ready for the next take because we still have to fine tune, the way this is being displayed or whatever. And Michael Bay called Mark the graphics Nazi. And he was like, and when he said that, like, I knew I had made it. Like that was my crowning achievement. I was like, yep, that is 100% Mark right there. Not that he's actually a graphics Nazi, but that he derives pleasure from bringing, director Michael Bay to near tears over something like that.
Well, also the design's got to be great. I mean, that's one thing.
But this is the thing. This stuff is so meticulous.
Yeah. Every pixel.
There's infinite amount of detail in all of these things. Like it's never ending.
For any designers out there who want to take a look at these, I don't know if these are full res, but look at every pixel. Every pixel. This was a time when I had heard of people. I'd seen people doing pixel perfect designs, right? But they would do it on a little part of something, and I would see his designs. He sent me early on just a huge package of all of his one-to-one exports of his screens, and so I could see every single pixel is perfectly designed, and I'd be like, well, how are you designing that? And he's like, well, you're working zoomed in one window, then you have another window of it zoomed out. And so you're making big things over here, big changes and movements. And here you're detailing and making sure everything is pixel perfect aligned. That's the first time I ever realized anybody would ever have the patience to do that, for one, and that was even a thing. And a lot of us now are pixel obsessed. But that's what a UI design, is. I mean, UIs are pixel perfect when they're designed well.
Well, it's crazy though, because and he had the opportunity to spend some time working on real world technology products, which, as you know, it's very difficult and challenging work, but compared to film, it's practically a vacation, in terms of the amount of time that you have to create for these spaces. This is such a simple graphic, but there's these unbelievable details that are blended in here. First off, the fact that he's able to adapt into a visual language that is like unquestionably like a very traditional airport wayfinding motif, yet it still has just the right details to feel as though, well, this is actually a little more sophisticated and a little more advanced. And then at the same time, it's not super advanced because you actually have like alternate images like burning in to the background, like
you see
all three messages like never go all the way away, like and it just starts to imply certain like limitations in the technology that immediately make it feel so much more realistic and like authentic.
Yeah. And it's designed in, it's not, that's the funny thing about a lot of film UI design. You're designing in the imperfections.
Yep.
Rather than getting it for free. You're having to put it there.
I love that. This is a really fun gag in the film Children of Men, and it's such a like almost throwaway thing, and it's this such fascinating detail that you see this kid and he's playing this like abstract puzzle game.
Yeah.
And like between the visualization of the game and just the way the scene is directed, it's like treated as though like the kid who's playing this game, his brain has been rotted by it, like it's just absolutely wild. Great film, great project to see him involved in.
Bring up that deja vu down.
Which one is right here?
Yeah. There you go.
Oh, yeah.
So
this is like
wall of monitors that they had in that scene.
I mean, so much content that you have to generate for something like this.
Yeah.
And again, this is like, it still looks like it's like in a, Windows XP package, but is the world's most advanced version of that anyone has ever seen.
And the gyro. So
yeah,
that's the first thing that I learned from him, like learned from him, was making a gyro. And we were both writing a chapter for a Richard Harrington book called AE at Work. And his chapter was on making something like this. And man, I studied that thing and I made my own. I was so excited. And then every film, almost every film I've worked on, there's been a reason to make some kind of gimbal. So I've revisited that and remade some kind of gimbal like this for every chance I get. I'm always remaking it, trying to perfect it,
That's it. It's one of those like hyper practical sort of things that still today, as familiar as, gyroscopic layouts or even like, the gyroscopic ball in a glass sphere of fluid or whatnot. It's still something that feels very advanced and sophisticated. So like, yeah, I've had numerous go-arounds on this sort of motif, certainly branching off from this. If you own a Hummer EV, you get one of these as a visualization in your vehicle. This looks also like very accurate to like, what is it? You would know this better than I would, like a PFD, that main instrument that's in an aircraft usually, like
MFD?
even like the most basic, flight gyro.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and what's interesting is after I had made a few of these too, I always knew that Mark really loved Simon Staines, who basically taught Mark. And I was watching this movie that Simon had done, and it was I think it was Thunderbirds, I think. And in his screens, Staines has a gyro that looks very much like this. And I'm like, okay. So Staines probably taught Mark how to do this, because it's a complicated process. Like you're doing each little piece and you're using expressions and things to align them in, because all these were done in After Effects, so you're duplicating. Yeah. You're making the whole 3D structure by this complex null turning, going frame by frame over 360 frames. It's a really clever process to get these.
And then you finish it and you rotate it and it like wobbles a little bit. You're like, no, my anchor point was off for every single layer.
It takes forever to render because it's just too many pieces and bits. Yeah.
Amazing stuff. Yeah. So much detail, so many different, nods to super authentic tropes and whatnot. So, you know, Mark, he made a huge mark in film. You know, to me, he was always, and I know there are other people before him that were doing some of this kind of work, but he was truly the first person that I had seen where it was like his body of work was this, and he had mastered it with this like combination of like consistency, but also this incredible range and being able to flex. And so there was a certain point where he, again, sort of like, you know, went off the radar into working on super secretive real world technology projects and whatnot. And I was, and I'd been in touch with him throughout this process. And, you know, he was spending time at Samsung. Most recently, he was working with Volvo on who knows what sort of amazing and exciting things that probably the public still won't even find out about for 2 to 5 more years before his contributions are made public. But I was really, really stoked about 2 years ago that he popped back up in the world of fiction in Westworld.
Yeah.
And so, and this is like, you know, my relationship, I was not super, super close with Mark. We stayed in contact on a regular basis, but I didn't always know exactly what he was up to. And I think my mental image was that he was getting, you know, deep into real world tech. And maybe in a way that can at times become a little bit of a grind. Like you work really hard on things and then maybe the major corporation that you're working for cancels them, even though you've been working on it for a year or things like that. And I, you know, was, I don't know, like there was part of me that was like, I wonder if like the Coleran era is like, you know, of these dramatic, mind-blowing, incredibly influential things is like, you know, getting lost in these real world, you know, top secret projects. And then he jumps into the last season of Westworld.
Yeah.
And puts together, I think, some of the greatest work of his career.
Absolutely.
And stuff that immediately, like for me, like I was rejuvenated upon seeing some of this stuff. I mean, look at this thing and knowing like the concept of Westworld and that there's these sort of like story trees and personality pathways and whatnot. And seeing that visualized as something like this is a narrative builder. And like, what a perfect way of like, you know, a narrative begins and takes all these winding paths. Like it's so brilliant conceptually, but it's like achingly gorgeous. Like it's so perfectly composed. The like just the weight of everything, the balance of, again, these strong silhouettes, the heavy use of like translucency and blurring to keep everything soft, and then the really precise high contrast line work that has all this detail, but it doesn't get so complex that it becomes like purely tangled spaghetti. Like you can follow this and you can make sense of this.
He was really,
and like to me, that's this like masterful thing in this space, right? Like the hardest thing to do is to create something where it makes the character in the story look like they are the smartest person in that world, yet the person sitting on their ass on the couch wolfing down a burrito while watching this can also make sense out of it
in a second,
but still relate to like, oh yes, yeah, the main character is the most brilliant person in this world because that's the only person that could make sense of something.
Yeah.
Like just this is witchcraft. Like
It
this
is.
is insane.
Yeah. I call it complex minimalism because, you know, you're designing in a maximal kind of complexity. This looks complex, looks like only a genius would understand it, but it's got to be minimal in the effect of the audience has to understand what's happening in a few seconds. Usually that's all you get. So yeah, it's brilliantly done. Did you, when you watched this, and I hope everybody goes and watches this season because in particular, these scenes are on glass. They're amazing. They're really amazing when you see them all comped in. I don't know if he has comps or renders, but yeah, it's just really well done. Yeah.
Really, really spectacular stuff. And there's a whole number of pieces that he had contributed in here. There's a few more that really blew my mind. Like this is very straightforward, kind of like FUI content. You've got a map, you make it topographic because topographic maps look cooler and whatnot. And then you have like widgets and panels and tabs that surround it. But like the design of each of these individual pieces is so thoughtful. And I love that like Mark is so far past the containers that have just like random edges and trapezoidal corner cuts and whatnot.
Yep.
And that this is like very straight-laced information design and control panels that would be hyper functional today, but are still like, they still feel advanced. They still feel sophisticated. Like I love these little areas over here, and you have this bold, iconic graphic that immediately gives this sense of simplicity and clarity. I love the like aspect ratio of these individual buttons, the use of color, the consistency of the iconography, and this sort of like icon language that Mark, you know, probably he either spent a ton of time or he just does something like this in his sleep and it just happens like auto magically for him. But just incredible.
He's got a lot of dedication to this, and he designs it as a system. That's why it looks like it all would work together. So each of these is not just a random widget that he's making. He's making them to all work together and fit together. And he had to do that. He's done this type of work since the beginning because he told me, you know, he'd have a screen, they'd spec it out. They'd say this screen is, you know, whatever resolution by whatever revolution. The resolution would be set. He'd design to it, and he'd get to onset, and they'd say, "Oh, we changed the monitor. It's actually bigger. It's wider. Aspect ratio is different. Everything's different." And so he said he came up with an idea where he would design in a way that he could just add a panel, and now that screen is perfect for the new resolution. So his designs would work for all these different aspect ratios. It's really like responsive design, but that's why these, like, if you look at the bottom two are like the bottom two, if you put them together, is the top two. You know, it's very works together very, very cohesively. Because he's thinking like that. He's thinking in systems, which is brilliant.
And you look at this stuff, and I mean, we're looking at a static image, and you know exactly how these things could move. Like you look at them and you know that like, well, they're going to unfold in this way. And these pieces are going to like stay aligned even in motion and whatnot, because that's, you know, the visual like rules are all apparent. Like they're all there for us to see. It's so spectacular, so expertly done. I'm just, you know, I remain in awe. And like, to me, this was just It was just very like comforting and reassuring to me to see something like this come from Mark, much further into his career. Jayse, is there any other particular projects that you would like me to pull up or take a look at or discuss?
Man, if you just scroll through.
And actually here, I'm going to jump over to Kirill from Pushing Pixels. Did this wonderful thing of basically bringing Mark's original website back to life. It had gotten kind of, run over by the internet, and he's somehow gotten a version. And I'm not sure if this was his most recent or a much earlier version. I love this stuff, like how alien and abstract technology can get. But it's like, again, it's like you see the rules,
Yep. Yep.
Look at that. It's just amazing.
There you go.
I absolutely love this. Yeah.
That's why it looks good, because it was, actually thought out. Yeah.
Incredible. Yeah. So many of these things are just, so much thought put into this stuff. It never ceases to amaze me. Few will know that Mark designed Magic Bullet looks.
Very familiar. If you use looks.
Yep. Pretty, a super, super commonly used tool. But yes, this guy was behind the scenes on that.
Yeah. I mean, if you go to update to 2057.
Whereabouts
down
is
a bit.
that?
Yeah, right there. It's kind of up from your cursor.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Man.
So this is the kind of thinking that, that systematic thinking of pieces. And, one thing that I really love about Mark's UI design, it's never a rectangle, it's never like it's never a rectangle. It's always pieces coming off and flaring out and making really dynamic shapes. The shape language is just brilliant. And that angle to the main menu just it just brings it all together.
Yeah. That's really spectacular.
Colors as well on this one I really love.
Astounding that, and a lot of the work that we're looking at, especially the reels that we had playing earlier, those are between like 15 and 18 years old.
Yeah.
And I would say this broader field, so at that point in time, it was Mark Coleran did this work. Today, it is a full-on cottage industry. There are multiple studios of varying sizes, all doing amazing, incredible work, doing specifically this exact work, like that this guy sort of put on everyone's radar. There are now multiple businesses employing entire teams of artists. There are waves of freelancers who say, like, I am a FUI artist. That's what I do. I do this and I bounce between these different studios, or I go back and forth between working on films and working on products or cars or aircraft or whatnot, right? Like this has become a pretty pervasive sort of thing. And at the same time, looking at all of this work of Mark's from way back, the industry hasn't necessarily, there's amazing work being done, but it's not radically different from where Mark was in 2006, 2008. And I mean, to me, that's just remarkable. I mean, this stuff is, I don't know when this project is from, this update 2057, but you could show this to a film director today and they would sign off on it with no hesitation. And I'd be certain that this is, at least 12 years old, if not more.
Yeah. Yeah. He made the good point of sometimes you have to point out to directors that, like, sometimes they'll say, hey, we don't want anything futuristic, right? Let's just make the screens look. So like Bourne Identity, Bourne Ultimatum, they were like, hey, let's make these look, just current. And he'd always jazz them up a little and make them a little bit futuristic because he would tell the director, like, listen, in 5 years, do you want your film to look dated? And they'd say no. And he'd say, okay, I'm going to make it at least 5 years out then. And that's a brilliant way to look at it. Look at this. It's like a Photoshop thing. Look at this. I
mean,
he didn't get his way. I'll tell you an interesting story. Look at the top of this. So one of the favorite parts of this film, especially in his reel, if you go up, is the handprint scanner.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Scanner, right. And so amazing because you put your hand on it. It actually animates out each of those little puzzle pieces to it, and then it scans and clears them. So this is what he presented. This is what's in his reel. And one time I had done this design for a film and it didn't get picked. And I was like, they want something, really simple. I was like, so what happens when you make your reel? Do you put what was picked for the film, or do you put what you designed? And he said, oh, no. And he showed me this and he said, they didn't pick this. I was like, really? I've been watching it in the reel so much. I swear that was what was in the film. And he's like, no, watch the film again. He goes up, puts his hand on there, and 2 green boxes come up. Just 2 green boxes. And that's what's in the film. That's what they decided to go with. So he's like, I just cut it. In the reel, I have him go up, put his hand up, and I cut to this. And I thought, that's brilliant. He's like, don't put, other people's mistakes in your reel. Your portfolio is for what you intended.
That's I love the way that you phrase that. Don't put other people's mistakes in your reel. It's worth noting on the topic of the reel that, like, Mark established the, like, don't ever just present flat, Photoshop assets. Always tilt them with a shallow depth of field and a little pixel overlay as if they're actually being seen on a display. And you throw a little extra glow on it and you throw a little chromatic aberration in there. And this is like, this is now default. Like you nobody in this space does this sort of work without presenting work in that way. Well, listen, this is, first off, Jayse, it's always amazing to just connect and chat with you. And this is terrible circumstances with which we are doing this, but this brings me so much joy going through this with someone like yourself, who I know has a tremendous understanding and appreciation of the work, but also has a very strong connection to Mark. I can't help but to just, express some general gratitude for the fact that back in 2006, I had stumbled across this guy's reel. I consider myself unbelievably fortunate to have had a career with wonderful successes and a huge amount of difficult work, but work that I derive an enormous amount of satisfaction from. And I can't even imagine what I would be doing today if I hadn't crossed the amazing sort of like flaming trail that this guy was blazing through the industry. It made it like I feel like I can't overstate this, but it like absolutely made the biggest impact on me and my life, and in a way that means a lot to my profession, but the way that my profession is like, for many of us, our profession's not just a profession, it's a really big part of our lives and our identity and who we are, and something that affords many other wonderful things to be a part of our lives. And so, I just, I can't be more thankful that this guy existed at all and paved a pathway that I unabashedly just, followed and wanted to mimic, and in a way that, did so much for me. So I will continue to appreciate this guy, as far as I go and I'm doing what I'm doing. None of this work, none of this impact will be anywhere close to being forgotten at any point.
No. Yeah, it's brilliantly said. I agree. I think he lives on in not only his work, which definitely he lives on in your work and my work, and countless other designers who took his work as inspiration, but also lives on in just how much he gave to us. I think everybody that's met him would feel that way. And that's what I remember most, is how giving he was, very freely and very, very humble in a humble way. And I'm glad that we got to get together and chat it out and pay our respects and have a little drink, pour one out for him. So appreciate you having me on to talk about him. He was a good friend, and I'm just glad that his work lives on, that so many people are going to bat to bring his website back and to really like honor him. I've got constant text messages over the past few days, and we're just all celebrating an amazing life, an amazing contribution as well. And
I love the fact that, we will be going about our day, years or decades from now, and still a piece of his work will like flash up on a TV or a movie screen or something, and it'll bring it all sort of rushing back in those moments. Or for me, anytime I'm sitting down in front of like a new and frustrating brief of some kind, I will immediately just be like, man, how am I going to tackle this? And I'll be like, oh yeah, there was a guy that could nail all this stuff, make it seem highly imaginative while also incredibly grounded and thoughtful. Yeah, it's a never-ending gift that we got many years ago, and we're fortunate enough to keep getting years and years of it.
Yeah.
Mark, you will be remembered tremendously, and we will do our best to keep pushing forward the pixel perfect accuracy the clever designs, and being an absolute ball breaker to only the top tier Hollywood directors that are out there.
Absolutely, man. Cheers to Mark.
All right. Cheers to Mark.